evening, and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Gary Kamiya in conversation with Paul Madonna. My name is Jamie Madsen, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and will also be your host for the evening. Copperfield's Books has been committed to literature, education, and creating community together since our founding in 1981. I'm excited to remind you all that all 9 of our stores remain open for both inside service and curbside pickup. And also like to take a moment at the beginning here to thank each and every one of you for supporting us. COVID-19 has been a serious struggle for independent bookstores like us. And without the support of people like you, we would not be able to provide this free program. So we at Copperfields are very grateful. So just a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce tonight's authors. We will be using the chat box to provide links to view upcoming Copperfield's events, details for purchasing tonight's title, as well as links to purchase previous works by both Gary and Paul, and will also include my contact information for follow-up details. And a quick note about the book, it is only available in our stores. So we'll touch on that later. I will share the link where you can read more, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Additionally, the Q&A box will be our go-to with any questions or comments for tonight's speakers. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A icon. Please go ahead and submit your questions here rather than replying to my posts in the chat box. Thank you. So without further ado, I am so thrilled to introduce our first author for the evening. Gary Kamiya is the author of the #1 San Francisco bestseller, Cool Gray City of Love, 49 Views of San Francisco, which won the Northern California Book Award for creative nonfiction and is widely considered one of the best books ever written about San Francisco. He writes a very popular history column for The Chronicle, a co-founder of Salon.com and the former executive editor of the San Francisco Magazine. Kamiya has been a fixture on the Bay Area literary scene for more than 30 years. He currently lives in San Francisco. And in conversation with Gary tonight is Paul Madonna. Paul is an award-winning artist and author. His popular series, All Over Coffee, ran in the San Francisco Chronicle for 12 years and has been collected into 2 sui generis bestsellers. Paul is the creator of the Emmett Hopper Mystery Series, and his unique brand of combining images and stories has been heralded as an all-new art form and celebrated internationally in galleries and museums as well as print. They're both here with us tonight to discuss Gary's latest title, The Spirits of San Francisco, Voyages Through the Unknown City. We're all so excited to dive in tonight and could not be more thrilled to have you here with us this evening. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Gary. Why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Okay, well, thank you, Jamie, very much for that introduction. I would just like to clarify one thing. This is not my book. This is my book and Paul's book. So Paul and I were full equal collaborators, and it was a real thrill to work with such a phenomenal artist as Paul. And in fact, there's kind of a funny story about how our collaboration came to be, because for Cool Gray City, I wanted to get Paul to do the art for that book, because I'd been a big admirer of his since reading All Over Coffee in the Chronicle, which for those of you who may have seen that, it really was a unique way of doing art, of doing narrative, and of looking at cities in general, and at San Francisco in particular. It was very sort of haiku and Zen-like, very minimalist, quite obscure parts of the city, but it added up to this poetic, very personal vision. And and he's an incredible draftsman, an incredible technician with pen and ink. And so I really wanted to use Paul, and we reached out to him. And Paul, you can explain why that particular time it didn't work out.
Thanks, Gary. And I'll take a moment to thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Copperfields. Really happy to be here tonight. And everyone who's taking their Friday evening to hang out with Gary and I, will do our best not to disappoint. Yeah, so this was, I think it was like 5 years ago. And Bloomsbury contacted me and they said, they're being really secretive. And they said, hey, we have a project for you. The author really wants you. Are you interested? I said, sure, send it over. And so they sent me a galley of Cool Gray City. And I sat down with it and it was phenomenal. I loved it from the start, page one. And I was like, yeah, I'd love to work on this book. And then I looked at subtitle, which was 49 Views of San Francisco. It's like, all right, well, that's pretty, it's pretty clear, but I think that maybe I might need to do 49 drawings for this. So I got back in touch with Bloomsbury and I was like, sure, I'd love to. How much time do I have? And they said 6 weeks. And I was just like, well, it was impossible. I was in the middle of a novel. I was still doing Oliver Coffey weekly. I think I might have even been doing my other cartoon series, Small Potatoes weekly at the time too. And I was like, it's just impossible. I can't do that many drawings in this period of time. So unfortunately, I had to pass. But I took the opportunity to reach out to Gary and say, hey, man, this isn't personal. I would absolutely love to do this. But I just, the timing won't allow it. And then it was probably about a year later because Gary and I met at the Northern California Book Awards ceremony where he was getting the award for Cool Gray City. And I was actually getting an award for my second book, Everything is Its Own Reward. And we got to meet for the first time. And within minutes, we were just cracking each other up and as if we'd known each other forever. And that night we shook hands and said, all right, someday we're going to find a project and we're going to make it up together. We're not going to let somebody else bring it to us and it took 5 years, or I guess 4 years, but it took 4 years until this opportunity came around. And that's when we created Spirits.
Yeah, and Paul, the way it came about was you were working on a ongoing series at a local San Francisco magazine called the Nob Hill Gazette, which is an oversized format, a really high quality paper. And Paul was doing this fascinating series, but that's how we came to work. So why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, so I ended All Over Coffee in 2012, or excuse me, 2017. And I needed a break from weekly publishing for a while. But then about 2 years later, the Nob Hill Gazette contacted me and offered me a monthly series. And I was like, all right, that's a good reason to get back into something and not too much output. But I decided to do something different than All Over Coffee. I wanted to sort of turn around and do the opposite of what that had been. And, with All Over Coffee, I never drew iconic scenes. I always chose those really, obscure in between building moments. My joke was if I saw a group of people taking a photograph of a site, I'd turn around and draw what was behind them. And it was because I wanted to show the beauty of San Francisco that was in the cracks. And that was what the stories of All Over Coffee were too. But I decided to go at it another way. And I decided to do a history series and draw a lot of iconic scenes. And that can be really challenging because as lovers of San Francisco or as viewers or readers, we have such a relationship with iconic scenes. We see Coit Tower and whether it's a drawing, a photograph, a painting, we see Coit Tower and bring to it everything we know and all of our memories and our feelings. And so my challenge to myself was, how do I draw these scenes in a way that's new? How can I bring my personality to them? And I was enjoying doing that. But after, not long, 4 or 6 months, the research, the historical side of it was overwhelming me because it wasn't really my forte so much. And so that's when I thought of Gary and our handshake. But at the same time, I didn't want to just invite Gary into that series and sort of fit him into a mold I had already created. So I went to the Gazette and I said, hey, I'm thinking about retooling. And they're like, great, okay, let us know. So then I called up Gary, invited him to my studio and said, listen, let's just start over. And I'll draw, you write, let's figure it out. And I think within an hour and a half, we came up with the structure and the bones. And from the very first moment we started, it was, this will be a total collaboration and we'll work together, but we're also not going to step on each other's toes. And the goal was to let each other do what we did best.
Yeah. And I remember that day in your fantastic old studio, the one you don't have anymore on Detroit Avenue. And I walked in and there was this kind of mind blowing about, I think what was it, 3x5 or 4x6 drawing of
Feet.
Lombard Street.
Yeah, 4 by 5 feet.
Yeah, 4 by 5. I mean, this is an incredibly sort of hallucinatory because it's something the human eye would not take in. It's more like an enormous lens, and it shows this very, it's so well known, it's almost hackneyed, but Paul's view of it, made it like, like Lombard Street on acid. In fact, Paul, do you want to show that piece if you've got it
Yeah,
in your,
you want me to show Lombard?
yeah, show Lombard Street.
Yeah, we'll do.
First thing I saw when I went into your studio.
Yeah, here we go. 1 second. Yeah, that drawing should be on the screen. Gary, do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, I knew Paul's work, and I'd been to some gallery openings where I'd seen, full-sized drawings of his, but, seeing one of San Francisco like this just completely blew my mind. I mean, this is not a view of Lombard Street that anyone other than maybe a highly evolved ant would and so, we just started talking about, hey, what can we do? And I said, well, I've got a lot of stories about Lombard Street and all these other famous places. Of course, I have stories about the famous places, but what we decided right then and there that we wanted to do was shift away from just doing these kind of iconic, really famous scenes. We wanted to continue to do some of those, but we wanted to just open it up so that we would do basically whatever floated both of our boats. And really, they had to float both of our boats. That was kind of our working model. It was like, if I liked the story, but it didn't work for Paul's artistic vision, then that wouldn't work. And, if Paul had something that he loved, but I didn't really have anything to say about it, then I might not want to do that. But most of the time it was pretty seamless. Most of the things we came up with, we both enjoyed. There were some, and it worked. Now, there were some interesting exceptions. There was one Victorian building that when we got into our collaboration, didn't end up working. But I'll delay that story for a minute because I want to finish just telling how this book came to be. So we started working on the Nob Hill Gazette series together, but both of us from the beginning always had in mind a book. So we love doing the series. As I say, it's a tremendous format for art in the Nob Hill Gazette because it's oversized and really high quality paper. So that's fantastic. And they, give us complete liberty to do what we want. But we also wanted to make this more ambitious and make it a book. So we were planning that from the beginning, and then we kicked it around, like how many drawings will it be? How many chapters? How long will it be? And we just started doing both of them at the same time. We sort of got a head start on the book while we were doing the magazine collaboration. And it was just, it was a really incredibly gratifying collaboration for me. For a lot of reasons. I mean, the most rudimentary one is that as a writer, you often don't get to collaborate with anyone at all. I've been a magazine editor and journalist for many, many decades. So I did have the pleasure of working on a team on a magazine and getting to work with art directors and with artists and brainstorming concepts of art for my stories and other stories. So I did have that pleasure, but rarely and never did I get to work with an artist as accomplished as Paul on just a big project that was all mine, and that, all mine on the writing end, and that, that working with an artist like Paul. So that was really fun because, it gets a little lonely in the old writing desk, and just not only the final result, but the process of coming up with these sites was really fun. And Paul, you can tell some of the funny stories about our scouting expeditions and some of the stuff that we did.
Well, yeah, and I want to talk about the collaboration a little bit more too, and that idea that we really knew we wanted to do a book. And I think it's because we saw this as more than just one-offs. We understood that, we were doing a portrait of the city, and to do that was to not just look at one site. It was to look at a lot of sites. And I think we sort of did this A/B thing a lot, where we, went really headlong into the iconic, and then like, let's find some obscure. And and that satisfied both of our needs for telling the stories of the places that we found like to be the little crevices, the fun little stories. But it also sort of pushed each other to look at the city from different points of view, because as I said, I'd been doing Oliver Coffey, and I really wanted to look at the city differently and to draw it differently, to be able to bring something fresh to it. And that can be a real challenge, because you get used to going out and working a certain way, and even the style of drawing. I was doing the same drawing that I'd been doing for years. But to see the city through Gary's eyes, and to go back to that first moment in the studio when he walked up to Lombard Street, and really, I tried to take a really different view on it than every photograph I've ever seen. But Gary pointed to one of the houses in the background, and he just started telling me a story about it. And what I loved about that was, I don't know how long it would have taken me to uncover a story about that house in my own research. But Gary just had this encyclopedia knowledge in him, and there was so much joy. And sorry to be speaking in the third person here, but like, there was so much joy when you were telling this story. And I was excited. It was a great story. And I thought, well, this is wonderful, because he found something in here that isn't just, oh, here's the classic story of what's not exactly the most crooked street, right? Like, we've heard that, we've read that before. And so when we were out scouting around, there was a real sense of, I would listen to Gary's stories and that he had to tell, and we'd go to these sites, and I'd but I would look for what really turned me on. And I might not have looked on that street before, or that corner. And then the same was true for, I would bring up certain sites and say, Gary, I'm really interested in drawing this. Do you know anything about this? And either he would or he wouldn't, but then it forced, and that's a big word, but it maybe allowed is a better word, allowed him to then say, oh, well, what are the stories there? And so then there's different stories coming from Gary in the same way that there are different drawings coming from me. And that is a sort of a really high level of collaboration, because instead of just sitting down and saying, well, I'll do this part and you do this part, it's this conversation that goes back and forth. And by the end of the evening, you've talked about topics that you would have never considered having a conversation about before. So that's not necessarily the details, because we do have some fun stories, and I'll actually pass it back to you about was it Pier 30, I think?
Yeah, well, I do want to say, just in terms of following up on this sort of deep collaboration aspect. Yeah, there's a really good example of one site that Paul was excited about that I knew literally nothing about. I may have seen this building, but I'm not even sure if I had it faded out of my memory. It was pretty close to Paul's studio, and he'd seen it in his wanderings around in that neighborhood, and became fascinated with it. And this was one of the ones where I just said, okay, this is such a crazy building.
Is it the Rock House?
Yeah, the Rock House.
And okay, I'm gonna pull that up. Cool.
Yeah, and it looks so amazing that I'm gonna.
Sorry, wrong one. Sorry, I'll get the right one up. My fault.
Nope, no problem.
Oh, computers. Here we go.
Yeah, so this is a very, very strange building. It's enormous. It's about, I think, 7,000 square feet or something. And as you can see by looking at its platform, it's built on this enormous extrusion of a rock called serpentine or serpentinite, which is the California state rock. And it's a rock that runs in this great diagonal pattern across San Francisco. So you get it not only in Potrero Hill, where this is, but you get it way up at the Golden Gate Bridge as well. And Paul had just always noticed this weird, vast building standing on this huge rock platform. And one of the reasons I'd never really noticed it is because it's in a very peculiar part of town, right on the other side, beyond the far side of this view. The freeway is about 20 feet away from this house. And when it's 101 freeway. And when they put the 101 freeway through, they basically bisected Potrero Hill. So this actually is this kind of orphaned part of Potrero Hill. You could call it Potrero Hill West. And very few people are going to go up here because the roads that run around this house all dead end. And so it's just sort of sitting there. But I just decided, you know what, I hope I can find out something about this building. And the thing about, the more you start digging around and doing history on specific sites in a city, like there's almost always some kind of story. And with a building this unusual, there's likely to be several stories. And in fact, this this building had some truly peculiar histories attached to it. It was actually created to be a boys' home. I was by a very famous San Francisco architect, the leading anti-Victorian. He was sort of an avant-garde architect. He was actually a divine. He was a Swedenborgian minister named Joseph Worcester, a very Christ-like figure who was also an amateur architect. And he built a couple of houses up on top of Russian Hill that, for me, as somebody growing up in Berkeley, they didn't even look like anything because they look like the houses that I grew up with in the Elmwood. But these houses are actually revolutionary because they were the first houses that completely defied the ornate Victorian aesthetic. And the famous bad boy architect Willis Polk sort of shared in this revolt against Victorians. So that's just, that's how this building began, as this, home for, working class, abandoned boys or orphans or boys that didn't have opportunities. And then it just went on to this completely strange second and third lives. It was actually a dormitory for San Francisco State after World War II, very strangely. And then it was the home of this highly eccentric art director and designer named Rudolf Schaefer, who lived to be 100 years old. And was even at age 70, he was a terrible businessman. He'd been running an art studio in North Beach, and he went to a psychic because he wanted to get a new studio. And the psychic said, "Oh, I see an abandoned building on Potrero Hill with broken windows." And he went over and ended up renting out the Rock House, as it was called, and was there for many, many years. Now, after those strange stories, it then entered into the much more mundane but equally bizarre in certain ways world of contemporary San Francisco real estate. And I think at first it sold for about 3 million, and I think now it's worth like 7 million. Its great room is like 35 feet high, and it has a complete view of downtown. It's enormous. So it's gone through, every permutation of San Francisco history. So this was just a fun example of how Paul dug up this strange building that he saw on his walks and, kicked it over to me. And I said, okay, well, let's give it a try. And it ended up having a bunch of great stories attached to it. And there were a lot of things like that. So there was this kind of fun serendipity that's a nice thing. And like Paul was saying, I wouldn't have gotten this. Like, it's not likely that I would have wandered around and seen that building and decided to write about it. I mean, maybe I would have, but it's kind of unlikely. So the fact that I had a collaborator with his own artistic vision and agenda, and that it ended up sort of playing in something that I could do my own work on, is really fun, because there's a sort of a random quality to it that is refreshing. It sort of takes you out of your own rut, and it forces you to just be open to new things.
Yeah, and yeah, that was such a great example because I feel like it, you know, when you're making a book that's history, and those stories are out there in various places. They're not necessarily current, or in anybody's consciousness, but often I think, how do we tell new stories? But that's a really hard question to answer, because you really have to know the stories you're telling and then kind of find the spaces in between. But I feel like that was what the Rock House was able to do for you, Gary, is like illuminate sort of the negative space.
Right.
And then you were able to do the same for me. And one example I'm going to show is Shipley Street,
Hmm.
which was just so much fun for me, because it hit a couple, like two different really good spots. Because one, I love drawing these kind of buildings. I love these wires for compositional, but this is the like quintessential San Francisco, but also not the super beautiful San Francisco. It's not like the gorgeous Victorians that we see on postcards, but it is so definitive of San Francisco architecture. And there's beautiful light on this, which for me, it's light and shadow is a huge component of being able to make a good drawing. But this was one of the sites that Gary took me to, because it just had such a great story, and we were out scouting for the day. And we walked the street now, and in a moment I'll let Gary tell you about Shipley Streets. But I came upon his house, and the lighting was from that day. This is that moment that we walked up on it, and I just said, "All right, I'm drawing this one. That story's going in. We're doing that piece definitely." And Gary was like, "Great, because I want to write that one." And I've been in San Francisco for 26 years now, and if I've ever been down Shipley Street, I couldn't tell you. And if I have, it certainly wasn't while I was out drawing and scouting. So of all the drawings I've made, I had never done this street before, and who knows what it would have taken. So that just really excited me, because it felt like just this beautiful little gift on a plate, that I could excitedly go out and draw. And Gary, do you want to tell the history of this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I just love this drawing. I mean, I've just those wires coming overhead are just, you're right there. I'm just waiting for them to fall on my head. But I first heard about Shipley Street. It was an old U.S. Geological Survey booklet, and it was called the Earthquake Subsidence Walk. And basically, what happened in the great 1906 earthquake, Shipley Street is south of Market. And as many of you know, south of Market, much of it essentially was built on a huge swamp of Mission Bay, swamplands that they just put houses on top of without, there weren't houses like this. They weren't running 100-foot long piers into bedrock. They were just sitting on this swamp. So when the earthquake of 1906 hit, many of these buildings on the south of Market alleys were, including a number of the most hideous and tragic, one of the most tragic occurrences in the whole earthquake happened about 2 blocks away from here, where 3 or 4 boarding houses literally collapsed against each other with hundreds of people in them, and many dozens of people, and the exact numbers are not even known, were crushed to death. And then those who survived were burned, the ones that couldn't get out. So there was real tragedy in the South of Market area. But some of the houses south of Market did not collapse. They simply subsided. They sank down into the muck. And if you look at this picture, you can see these windows that are right above the sidewalk. Well, those windows are, those are like, that's like a garage down there. This building is like half buried. The building should be extending, 6 feet or 4 feet. Usually I think the subsidence is anywhere from 3 to 6 feet down. So these buildings sank into the muck, and then the road later got regraded and covered them up. So there was just this, you ended up with these half buried buildings, and there's still a number of them. The 1989 earthquake actually damaged and destroyed a number of them. There aren't as many as there were even before 1989, but there are still a few of them left. And I remember when I was writing Cool Gray City, I went by this very building and kind of waited around for somebody to come out of it. And I interviewed this young dude who lived there, and he said, yeah, the hallway in this building is completely cattywampus. You know, if you roll a marble down it, it like tilts to one side by like 6 degrees. So, and yeah, because not only are they sunk, but a lot of them are also tilted. And so anyway, it's a fascinating part of town, and it was great to take Paul there and let him do his magic on this this really unique and strange. It's one of the few physical reminders of the earthquake. The earthquake by it and fire by its definition tended to destroy most things. There's a few things around San Francisco, including one on Joyce Street. And one famous building on Joyce Street that has bricks that were burned in the 1906 earthquake. So there's a few subtle reminders of the quake, but these sunken buildings are actually, some of the most dramatic ones. But maybe, we should maybe do the, Paul, do you want to do the Joyce Street one? Because that's another.
Yeah. Actually, do you mind? I want to do Haas really quick.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Because it's a good segue. I want to say one more thing about the Shipley Street is that, I'm often credited with being really detail oriented. But, if you look closely at my drawings, they have, my lines are a little wonky. My perspective is distorted just slightly, like enough to feel real, but also you could never put a photograph right over top of it. And that idea of the post-quake, the building that survived the quake, and that in itself is just like, it's not level, it's half sunk. It really just fit perfectly for my style of drawing, because that sort of wonkiness of the building is actually there. So it's interestingly more of a portrait than you'd even know. But I wanted to use that segue for a moment because to tell the story of the drawing that I didn't want to do, which was we decided that there had to be a Victorian, because we just wanted to sort of hit a lot of bases and cover a lot of ground. And there's a great Victorian that I'll let Gary tell about, but is Knobby Clark's Folly. And it's fascinating. But so Gary tells me about it, and I drive out and I go to Scouts, and I keep a compass on my phone, and I get there, and the building's sort of set back on a hill a bit. It's surrounded by trees, and I'm walking around, and the place is completely in shadow, and I'm using my compass, and I realize there's no time of day and no season that I'm ever going to get sunlight on this building from an angle where I can actually see it and draw. And I just knew that as beautiful of a building as it was, and as amazing of a story that it had, I would not be able to render it properly to really deliver my best work. So I kind of went back to Gary and I said, hey buddy, I'm sorry, but I can't draw this. And so can we do another Victorian? And so I want to just pull up really quick and show, we chose one that is actually a bit more iconic, and there probably is, maybe more out there already about. I mean, I certainly think, Gary, you brought some new information about it, but here was one where I could go out and I could really, I could showcase the building, I could draw it, I could get good light, and so that I could do a presentation. And again, to talk about the collaboration, that willingness to go back and forth. And, Gary didn't put his foot down and say, no, I have to tell the Knobby Clark story. And, and the same for me. There were some sites I didn't put my foot down. Like, it wasn't about the ego. It wasn't about putting our foot down. It was, hey, what can you do? And what can I do that's showcasing our best work? And let's meet in the middle. And that was really fun for me. Do you want to say anything about us, or should we go into Joyce?
Yeah, no. I mean, I'd just like to say that, I mean, the Knobby Clark's Folly is this other Victorian that we ended up not doing. And it had great stories, but I was really, for me, it was kind of actually really almost thrilling, even though it was a little deflating, to like hear an artist basically say, hey, this thing is hit with flat northern light. at all times, and there's no shadows, and it just doesn't work for me. And I knew, like, hey, plein air painters and real artists, they can't just like make these shadows up. They have to be there. But it was a kind of a learning experience for me that Paul came back, was like, I can't do this one. And and that I totally respected it. It completely made sense. And then it's like, okay, well, let's go on to plan B. And plan B, as you can see from this absolutely mind-blowing drawing, worked out pretty damn well. And and there's great, incredible stories. There's one of the things I do in this book is I tended to do maybe anywhere from 4 to even 10 different takes on each site. So in the case of this Haas Lilienthal house, one of the main stories that there is about it is this was it's the greatest surviving mansion of this unique San Francisco subculture, which was this extremely successful, very wealthy, very Jewish elite. And many of the people that succeeded, the most famous is Levi Strauss, but the Haasses, the Lilienthals, the Schlosses, the Gerstleys, the list, Steinhardts, the list goes on and on. And they were really a fascinating subculture. Many of them came from the same tiny village, which is pretty remarkable. And these guys would walk to work together from their big mansions, all of which many were right near the Haas Lilienthal house. They were kind of on Van Ness or on Franklin, between Broadway and California. And then they were not totally assimilated, but they were deeply acculturated. So that, for example, in the Haas Lilienthal house, there's a delightful book about it in which the author, who's a relative, remembers the opulent Christmas celebrations that were held in this house. So they were, and many of these they were German Jews, and there was a pretty big cultural and economic split between them and the Jews from Eastern Europe who immigrated later and who were much poorer. And there was considerable tension for a while between them. But ultimately, they came together, and, the very wealthy, educated German Jews, many of whom looked down on American culture as pretty backward. And, Goethe and Schiller and Beethoven and Brahms, that was the thing. And, this kind of American culture was kind of lame. But they were deeply grateful, deeply appreciative of San Francisco, which was not, it still had some anti-Semitism, but it was so much less than other parts of the United States. And one of the reasons was that, there was one of the anti-Semitic tropes that was always used against Jews was, well, they want to get rich. It's like, hello, the gold rush, it's not going to be that easy to like say, oh, how dare you want to get rich when everybody's trying to get rich. Furthermore, there was just no, the whole East Coast elite thing didn't play in San Francisco. You had judges and doctors digging ditches in the plaza because they were trying to make a buck and get out to the mines. So it was kind of, in a certain way, it was kind of a utopia for, and a lot of the Jews who came or were smart enough to realize, like, there's a famous expression, you don't make money mining in the mines, you make money mining the miners. And that was a much better way of making money. So that was one of the 3 or 4 of the vignettes that I wrote about that beautiful house, which is now the headquarters of San Francisco Heritage, thanks to the wonderful generosity of the Haas Lilienthal families who gave it to the Heritage Foundation. That's one of the stories. And then I talk about Victorians, because there's a lot to be said just about Victorians as well. So that was kind of my approach, and a lot of the book was, multi-storied approaches, so that there's, in the case of some of the chapters, there's maybe 5 or 6 completely different stories about these, about any given place. But Paul, do you want to show any other art? We've got a couple minutes left, I guess.
Yeah, I'll pull up Joyce Street because you wanted
Great.
to talk about that. I want to say quickly about, you were talking about the vignettes, and that was one of the things that was teased out of our initial conversation that first day we met in my studio planning the Nob Hill Gazette, because the Gazette, we wanted to limit to the word count to about 200, between 200 and 300 words. And,
Right.
you know, for making a book, for you to really be able to expound and tell the stories you want to tell and be able to tell,
Right.
we knew that, you know, you would need more space than that. But I think it set up this really cool precedent of, because we were working for publishing monthly at a time, and you had to think about the vignette, then you could think about all the different stories that you could tell and be able to present them as these individual pieces. And so again, that sort of different take on making a book, because we came at it from a completely different angle. And that idea of, oh, well, how are we working together to make this thing? So it's a good segue for the, I'll show, this is the first piece we launched with in the Gazette. And I think it was, you know, mutually, we both agreed it was a great piece to launch with for imagery and for story. And this is the Joyce Street stairs. And I'll just tell quickly my relationship with it and then pass it on to you, Gary, is that, again, this was one of those sites that I had somehow missed in all my years in San Francisco. And I was in a cab in traffic and it got stopped right in front of here. And I sort of turned to my right and I look and I'm like, there's a staircase going up there. How have I never seen it? And I took a quick photo of the next intersection. And then that home went, I went home and Googled it. And then the next day I went back and I walked that entire section. I was like, I want to draw this. And so I told Gary, and Gary's face lit up and he said, oh, he's like, oh my God, that's Joyce Street. I have so many stories there. And so it was just a fun entrance of this sort of serendipity and feeling like at least that I discovered something.
Yeah, and I think that particular drawing and the stories associated with it were perfect for us, because there's a kind of a monumentality to those stairs, you know, a grand quality. But as Paul says, many people have never even noticed them. And they're in the very heart of the city. That's what's remarkable about these stairs. These are off Pine Street, which is the main east-west, you know, going west arterial in downtown. And it's between Powell and Stockton. I mean, you can't get any more deep urban San Francisco. So having these grand kind of Spanish looking stairs going up with this little shrine to St. Francis on the landing is just so unexpected. And it was kind of a perfect combination of what we were doing in this book, of both the mundane, the unknown, and the really gorgeous, and with really superb stories. And the stories of that, and I'll just end at this so we can take questions, but what's remarkable about that little street, Joyce Street, is that it goes through 3 completely different universes in 3 blocks. So there's wonderful stories to be told. And anyway, it was a great choice to open the book, and we should open it up to questions now.
Great.
That was truly fascinating. I really enjoyed listening to you all, and I had, you know, so much feedback coming from people who are listening about spectacular drawings and the stories. And yeah, that was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
So we do have a few questions. And again, we only have a couple. If you guys have questions, go ahead and submit. But if we do have time at the end, I'm sure we would love any more peeks you can give us. So Kathy is wondering, how do you go about researching a building or a site?
Oh, well, there's many different ways. You can go, there's these things that are called Sanborn insurance maps, and they basically show every building that's on a site in a given year, and they list what they're used for. So that's a significant tool. There's city directories that you can look at, and reverse directories. There's different ways you can research buildings that way. if anyone really interested in the sort of geeking out on that, the San Francisco Public Library History Room, which is a wonderful resource for anyone who wants to research San Francisco. It's on the 6th floor of the San Francisco Library. Of course, sadly, no one can use it right now, but they have a whole little handout about how to research a building. And I don't particularly pretend to be the world's greatest expert on it. I mean, there's architectural preservationist firms, they do this for a living. I have really geeked out a couple times. I did a piece on a strange building that appears in Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, and then it no longer exists. And I did the deep dive on that one. I went down to the recorder's office, because that's when you're really geeking out. You're like, when did they turn the water on? When was it sold? And you're looking at these handwritten deeds of sale. And it was like, this is too much for me. And I don't have the money to buy a researcher for this. And I actually wasn't able to find out everything that I wanted to find out. It was just there was just too much. I couldn't do it. But you can find out a lot. And then you can just Googling, good old Googling, if you know how to do it well enough, and you sort of are persistent and come at it from a bunch of different ways, that helps. And then newspapers, you know, you can do search functions, both in the Chronicle and the Examiner. You can search by the name of a street, and you can often find significant information that way. And the Call newspaper is also online, although I don't think you can search in the same way. So, you know, there's just a variety of things. And then it's like, for me, the way that I do my kind of, oddball, idiosyncratic research is, whenever I see any book about San Francisco, I buy it and I just put it on my bookshelf. So I have an enormous library of books about San Francisco. And I sort of, in my mind, I now have a bit of a Dewey Decimal system of what might be in there. So it's not exactly a ironclad way of researching, but it helps, because I can actually find out things about streets and even buildings in some of the voluminous books that I've somewhat obsessively collected. So, there's a lot of ways to research things.
Can I just say, I love your vocabulary.
Oh.
It is great to listen to. Along those lines, Christina is wondering, do you ever interview the owners of the homes, and do you try to go inside the homes?
Oh, not very much. I mean, there have been times, I suppose, when I've done that, probably when I'm working on some magazine assignment or something. But no, in general, I'm a little bit of the sort of ghostly presence going by, and not intervening too much. Even the little bit of reporting I did on the guy who lived in the Shipley Street sunken home was somewhat unusual. I tend to do more just historical dives. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely been there are places where I ask people, do you know about this? Or, I mean, here's a funny example. This is kind of a modern one, but there's a really insane movie that it's a cult, terrible movie called The Room. And it's just like the worst movie ever made. And it's filmed in San Francisco. And there's this one, they keep using this external shot of this building. And my daughter and I became obsessed with this building. So we started driving, because there's one shot where they show the intersections. You can see it's like Bay and something. It was like Bay and Baker. So we started driving around there. And then they do this repeated shot where this ridiculous hero keeps going into this building, but it's a complete bait and switch, because as soon as they enter into the building, it's in a hideous little sound stage room that has nothing to do with the external shot. And clearly in the movie, they simply used the external building in the marina, and that had nothing to do with when they went inside. But so we drove around and we actually found the building. We compared the frames of the film and said, that's it. And then I went up to an old lady that was there and said, hey, did they did they ever, do you know anything about this ridiculous movie called The Room? Did they ever film it here? And she goes, oh no, I don't know anything about that. So clearly this Johnny Wiseau, this absurd filmmaker, clearly just did a drive-by. So yeah, I mean, I'll do, you know, little funny, you know, things like that, but it's not my main form of reporting on these things. It's more historical usually.
Got it. Kind of a fun question. Virginia is wondering, since it's almost Halloween, what is the most haunted site you've found in San Francisco?
Oh, this is a very popular question. Paul and I just did an event at City Lights. That was our launch party on Tuesday, actually. And we were asked the same question. And I unfortunately, I didn't have a great answer for it then. And I haven't done any more research on it now. I mean, what I sort of said on Tuesday is that there's many stories of buildings in San Francisco where strange crimes and weird things happened. But I don't know of any reports of poltergeists, you know, things that go bump in the night, noises. I mean, I'm not particularly a believer in those things anyway, but I'd be prepared to accept, you know, and be interested in reports of them if they were out there, and they probably are. There probably are some you know, places where people have heard that. I will tell one funny story about ghosts and just weird things that's in our book. Actually, it's out in the Land's End chapter out by Playland at the beach. There was a Chinese American war veteran, World War II veteran named Kit Hing Hui, and he became very depressed because he lost touch with his father died. His mother disappeared in communist China, and he lost touch with his beloved brother. So his whole family was gone. He got out of the army, and I think it was in about 1950, or I can't remember the exact date, he decided he was going to kill himself. So he walked out onto the Golden Gate Bridge, but then he later wrote, but it was too high. It was too scary. So he couldn't do it. So and then he walked down. He said, okay, I couldn't kill myself that way, but I'm going to jump into the ocean. So he goes down to near where Sutro Baths and Playland at the beach is, and he goes down to the waves. But then he says, oh no, the waves are too big and it was too wet. So he chickened out. But then he found a cave up above where he was going to jump into the water, a cave pretty near Sutro Baths. And he lived in that and another cave nearby for 5 years. And he never spoke a word to a human being except once and one time. But to keep his sanity, he sang the only 2 songs he knew, which were Home on the Range and Skylark. Skylark's unbelievably poignant that he sang that song because it has this most haunting lyrics, you know, Skylark, if you know, if you can find these things, my heart is rising on you. It's this really lonely song, but people used to hear as they moved around in Playland and out at the beach, they'd hear this out of tune foreign accented voice singing these songs. And so he became known as the Phantom of Playland. And then there's a happy ending. He actually got busted because he was always breaking into these restaurants and stealing just enough food to live on. And he kind of lived large because he would steal like sherry and cigarettes and turkey meat. So he had kind of good taste. But he only took a little bit. And when he finally got arrested, he was such a nice, upright guy. None of the restaurant owners wanted to press charges against him. And then as soon as he got arrested, his picture, he was on the front page of the paper, the Phantom of Playland. And his brother saw his picture. His brother appeared. They had a happy reunion. And basically, like literally the next day, there was a picture of him beaming, wearing a new suit with a haircut. It's like, I'm so happy. So he went from this crazy hermit existence to this happy existence literally overnight. but I like, that's kind of a good ghost story, you know. He was sort of a ghost and he came back to life. But I wish I had more ghost stories than that.
That was great. What a bizarre story.
It is as well.
Well, I know we only have a few minutes left here, but there is one question for you, Paul, and endless comments about how great your art is. This anonymous attendee wants to learn how to draw. Is there something that you would suggest doing? I find it truly amazing, the artist that you are.
Well, thank you. And, that's something I could talk for weeks about. So I will keep it very short. There's kind of two things. One, drawing is about seeing. So the first thing before you make any mark, if you want to draw something, sit in front of it and look at it and try to understand it. How is it put together? What are the shapes? What is it made of? And that's where, drawing cityscapes. Oh, hello. Drawing cityscapes is a great one because, when you're drawing people, they're looking back at you, they're moving, they're humans are complicated, and there's that expectation. But a city, you could say it's looking back at you, but not quite in the same way. And then the second thing is screw up. Don't worry about anything being good. You just start making marks and try to draw it, and then look at the drawing and don't judge it by, oh, is this exactly what I wanted to make? Look at it and say, oh, well, what is working here and what isn't? And in some respects, it's the same as any other pursuit. You get good by doing it. So practice.
Thank you both so much. This was such a great event and an awesome evening. I wish we had more time and you could just take us through the whole book. To all of you who are attending, I will be sending out an email tomorrow that will include a link to the recording of this on YouTube. It will include details for how to purchase, which again, it's available in all 9 of our stores, not online. So if you really don't want to go into a store, all you have to do is call one of our store locations and I'm sure they'd be happy to mail it to you or do curbside pickup. I also shared in the chat box tonight different previous titles by Gary and also a few different works by Paul, including his new Come to Light box set. So those details will also be included in the email. Just look out for that sometime tomorrow. And before we wrap up, is there any last things you'd like to say?
Yeah, I just would like to thank you, Jamie and Copperfields, for hosting us. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here with this audience, but support your local bookstores. And it's not a zero-sum game. Support Copperfield, support all independent bookstores. Now more than ever with COVID, so many small businesses are desperately hurting. We cannot lose these businesses. They're essential to our culture, to our cities, to our lives. Sure, if you have to get something on Amazon, do it. But you know what? We need to keep independent bookstores alive. So thank you to Copperfields, and Paul and I know are really appreciative of all the independent bookstores that just support us and all the other artists and writers out there.
Thank you so much, Gary. Oh,
yeah, I'd like to, sorry for interrupting. I want to echo, exactly what Gary said. And, I know for me that going into my local bookstore or bookstores all over San Francisco, it is my favorite thing to do, and just wander in and see what they have in the window, what their booksellers are reading right then and putting on the shelf. And, I can lose an hour without thinking about it, just walking in and picking up books. And unfortunately, we don't have as easy a time just wandering and browsing, but that's why we have to remember how important it is. And so absolutely, yeah, if you can support your local bookstore, please do. And Jamie, thank you so much. I'm happy that you could bring us here and we could do something for you guys tonight too.
You both were so wonderful. I hope in the near future we can get you under the same roof with us at an in-person event. But until then, stay safe, stay well, and have a great weekend.
Thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Jamie.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you, everyone.
Bye.